Hey, everybody. I'm used to doing things on Zoom, but I know I'm not able to see you all, sadly, but that's okay. My name's Tucker. As he mentioned, I'm the CEO of Thrive Impact. Our mission really is to solve nonprofit leader burnout and help to reduce or help nonprofit leaders to thrive and in order for them to be able to create impact from the inside out. So I'm excited to share a little bit about some of this next normal of leadership with you. But before we start, one thing that is a ritual that we do, I mean, quite literally in every meeting we have, in almost every workshop that we do, is we take a moment of pause. Now, for some of you, this might feel a little uncomfortable, but for some of you, this might feel quite refreshing. Maybe some of you have already been from meeting to meeting to meeting, or you were at that wonderful keynote earlier. Whatever it is, one of the things I know about us as humans is that humans are not machines, and that when we pause machines, they stop working. But when we pause humans, some of the better parts of us start to work, or at the very least, it's an act of kindness to ourselves. So I wanted to actually introduce or invite you in for just a moment to take a pause. And what does a pause mean? Well, that can mean all kinds of things. That can mean breathing a little bit more deeply than you were just a minute ago. When we breathe deeply, it actually engages the different part of our nervous system that helps us to come into regulation. Maybe it's you want to clean up your desk. Maybe you want to minimize windows so that way you can have full presence here today, because we know that I'm guessing you're all here to learn. And if you're here to learn, then having presence is actually one of the most important factors involved in learning. So we're going to just take 30 seconds. I'll play a little light music here for just a minute and just give you a moment to pause. That's it. And then we're going to kick it off right into the first part of our workshop. Nobody can see you. Nobody knows what you're doing, but I invite you to just for a moment take a pause. As an act of kindness to yourself. Maybe breathe a little more deeply, breathing in, and breathe a little more slowly, breathing out. Just another 30 seconds, that's all. Just a brief pause. All right. Hey, that was it. There's some incredible brain science that shows that when we're back to back to back to back to back to back, how many of you have ever done that? Been back to back to back on meetings, on Zooms, between home and work, that it actually creates more stress. Yeah, Lois, thank you for sharing that. And I'm watching the chat, by the way. Love interaction. And so pop those things up in the chat. But yeah, it actually creates more stress in our brains when we don't have a moment of pause. And so that's why we wanted to invite that. Hey, I have a workbook link for you today. No worries if you can't get this, but it is available for you. This is really just going to be a helpful guide throughout today. And I'm going to actually be sharing my screen. You can kind of see it. I'm going to be drawing different things on here as well. And so we're going to be going through this here today as a helpful little tool for you to take. Just pop that up in the chat. It is fillable as well digitally if you want to use that, or if you just want to have it up that you can scroll through. That's great. And what we're here to talk about today is leadership. Leadership. It's kind of a big topic, and I come to you today not necessarily as a thought leader, as a nonprofit leader and facilitator who's been studying the intersection between this ever-changing world that we're in and how leaders and teams at nonprofits can thrive and create impact from the inside out. Just a little bit about me. I'm an entrepreneur who actually many years ago started a marketing company, and we started to do fundraising campaigns and community activism type of work. I ended up turning into a philanthropist, didn't realize I was going to, raised about over $1 million for wildfire relief efforts out here in Colorado back in 2012. Ended up needing to create a nonprofit, and I learned how to give money away. It was a very fascinating boot camp around nonprofit work. And then from there, I really just fell in love with the world of nonprofits. I ended up moving to DC from Colorado, which is where I'm from, with my wife and our 4 kids. ended up selling the marketing company and went full on into leadership, ended up working at 3 different nonprofits out in the DC area. And when I was looking, what I was really looking for was, of course, deeper purpose, deeper impact, deeper meaning, frankly, in my own life. But what I ended up actually finding was pretty deep burnout. Has anybody, I'm curious by popping up in the chat, has anybody ever experienced what I'm talking about, where you've experienced what you thought you were going into was more impact and more meaning, and what you ended up finding was actually deep burnout? Well, I've totally been there. And as I've reflected, yeah, see, it's just like all up in the chat. Yeah, exactly. Thank you all for putting things up in the chat. It really is helpful and meaningful for me. And so, as I've reflected on this, I was looking at what are some of the different causes around what's going on inside of nonprofits and what's really going on. And I looked at this systemically. I realized, that systemically, that the system many times fights against us as nonprofits. And I'm going to share a little bit about that here in just a minute. I also noticed, though, organizationally around, particularly my burnout story, that I worked inside of an organization that had a wonderful vision for the world, but didn't live into it themselves. They didn't live into it themselves. A great quote by a guy named Fred Kaufman, who's the director of Conscious Business Institute out of MIT, said, when the gap between who we say we are and how we behave gets too big, it becomes no greater corruption of the organizational soul. And so part of what happened in my own burnout story is that that's what happened, is that I was involved in a corruptive experience, in a sense, because who we said we were and what impact we were trying to have in the world was not actually how we lived on the inside. But then, honestly, I also had my own individual issues and challenges that led to some of my own burnout. I really had too much idealism. And I've learned very deeply since then that when nonprofit leaders don't have a balance of idealism and realism, it can really mess us up. An old pastor once told me is that if you were disillusioned, well, what illusion did you believe in the first place? And I realized that I needed to grow in my own self-awareness and what really is happening and be able to be in more balance with myself. And so because of this particular story and because of my own experience, I had decided to dedicate my life to supporting those, and really all of you, who are in some of the toughest leadership conditions in our country. You are facing some of the toughest challenges that our country is facing and our communities are facing. And so that's why I started Thrive Impact about 5.5 years ago with a dear colleague of mine named Kevin Hagan. And our role is to how do we help nonprofits thrive so that they can have the impact that their communities need from them. And when I say toughest, what's interesting, I'm going to head over here into our work today, is nonprofits are really vital. Nonprofits are really vital. Nonprofits are 10% of the workforce and help to reduce violence, promote health and well-being, including the reduction of obesity, and are more trusted than any other institution based upon a study from the BBB. And yet, there are lots of stats, but the ones that I'm going to focus in on here today is that many nonprofits are lacking leadership development and support, causing attrition and impacting organizational effectiveness. Based on one study, 73% of nonprofit leaders say that they don't have the resources they need to develop their leadership. 73%. And this dearth of options is particularly egregious when compared with the private sector. Private sector companies spend 4 times as much on professional and leadership development as nonprofits do per year. And a lot of times this underinvestment is actually in part due to a systemic problem, which is a lack of focus on these challenges. Based on a study in 2017, less than 1% of foundation dollars have gone towards developing the nonprofit workforce. And this lack of leadership development investment is costly for our organizations. It leads to things like a lack of development and growth. It leads to disengagement. There was a study that was done by Gallup that said that 3,400 out of every $10,000 in salary is lost due to engagement of burned out employees. Basically, that's 34% of somebody's salary. If they are burned out and disengaged, you might as well throw in the trash. A complete waste of salary. And so, about this workshop, what we've been exploring is how do we create this impact from the out. And we've been studying this intersection, like I said, between an ever-changing world and how leaders and teams can thrive. And today I wanted to bring you maybe a unique perspective on leadership, a hypothesis, if you will, for you to explore yourself, a case for developing ourselves and our leaders in new and different ways. And in this interconnected world, as I've been sharing, a lot of times we have a vision for the world and we want to create impact. One of the best ways for us to really explore that is by creating impact from the inside out, as individuals, as teams, and as organizations, so that way we can have the impact our world needs from us. And so with that, what we believe, and based upon our own research and our own experience, is that nonprofit leaders of today and of the future need to have a dual interest. One in, and this is one of the questions that is driving us, what enables a nonprofit leader to thrive through change? And I'll share this here in just a moment, but when I say leader, I actually mean every one of you. Leadership to us is not a role, meaning if you're a CEO, therefore you are a leader. Leadership is about an active influence. Every one of you have the ability to influence your organization, whether you like it or not. And the question is not whether or not you're a leader. The question is what type of influence are you having? And so one of the questions that keeps us up is what enables a nonprofit leader to thrive through change? And the second one is externally. What enables a nonprofit team and organization to thrive through change? And so we want to boldly attempt to hit both sides in our very short time. This is very much a high-level overview around both external and internal. We also will have a lounge after this, and so which will allow us to go into a little bit more deeper work. So if you want to join me in the lounge after this particular experience, we'll be able to do that as well. By internal, what we're meaning, though, on the internal side, what we're meaning is how do we manage those moments when we are not at our best? When we're able to turn those moments to be more effective? How do we manage those moments and find out when are we in states of reactivity? And how do we get into states of creativity, where we can experience a process for becoming more aware of ourselves and of others? And when we're talking about leading well in the world, externally, we're getting more into how do we ask better questions in order to get better outcomes? How do we create experiences and have an experiential understanding for how to better create connection and belonging so that we can create better strategy for how we move forward? So I'd like to, before we keep going here, I want to do a brief exercise with you around effective leadership, because one of the things that I know is while I'm here to, teach you on some things that I've learned and grown and learned through our experience, I'm actually of the opinion that every one of you already have wisdom across all these, I was going to say all these Zoom boxes, but we don't have Zoom boxes, but out there in the audience, every one of you have wisdom to share. Every one of you already have wisdom to share. And so for just a moment, I'd like to invite us into a moment of reflection, I'm looking at the question. Am I good? Is everybody seeing what I'm seeing? I'm just curious. Yes. Does everybody? Yes. Okay, cool. Thank you, everybody. So I'd like to invite you into a moment of reflection, And this question are two questions. And I invite you to, if you have your workbook, you can jot them down. Or if you just want to grab a piece of paper, that's fine. Grab a pen. And I'd like to invite you to think about your own lived experience right now. And the first question is this: what qualities or characteristics do you display when you're a least effective leader? What qualities or characteristics do you display when you're a least effective leader? Jot those down. Jot down some different ideas. What qualities or characteristics do you display when you are a least effective leader? I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect on this. You might close your eyes. You might think about this. Some of you are putting it up in the chat already, which is great. Hope to answer your question. You said, how do I know when you are being a leader? As I shared earlier, and happy to reiterate this too, is Leadership to us is not about a role. Leadership is about influence, meaning you cannot not be a leader. You already are a leader, and the question is not whether or not you're a leader. The question is what type of leader are you being right now? So I'm seeing this up in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of this language. There we go. Hold on. I'm scrolling down here. Impatience, frustration, disconnected, poor communication, insecurity, emotional, lack of empathy, inability to clearly communicate, overwhelmed, lack of clarity, bad attitude, short attention span, frustration, tired, short, impatient, irritated easily. I hope you're scrolling through and looking at some of the wisdom that all of you have around leadership. Don't delegate. Don't share the burden. Yeah, and by the way, I noticed that you're all using those like buttons and heart buttons. Yeah, we call that resonance. That's a currency of a community. And so pop up whatever resonates with you. Defensiveness, micromanaging, broken promises, interrupting people, not listening. Woo. All right. All right. Hey, now let's shake it off. Let's do a little Swifty here. Let's shake it off. All right. Like, we all have those. I have those too. I get critical. I get biting whenever I'm a least effective leader. I don't look for the appreciation. I look for the edit, and I criticize in a negative way. That's what I do. So I want to shake it off for just a minute. And now let's take a look. What qualities or characteristics do you display when you are a most effective leader? How about a most effective leader? A most effective leader. What comes up for you? What comes up for you when you are a most effective leader? Personable, compassion, listener, encouragement, empathy, common ground, seeking common ground, open, communicative, supportive, shout outs, go-getter, collaborative, patient, fulfilled, empowered, communicative, engaged, listen and collaborative, kind. Ooh, I love that word. Such a powerful short word. Encouraging. Yeah, put your likes and your hearts up there too. What's resonating for you right now? Good delegator, kindness, excited, patient. Ooh, what a powerful word. Patient with myself and patient with others. Fun. I love that, Mandy. That's great. Pedro, forgiving. Angel, involved. Teresa, openness, creativity, open to new ideas, compassion, empathy. Level, calm, communicative, thoughtful. Involved, transparent. So you all can see. How many of you notice, just out of curiosity, how many of you notice the wisdom you actually already have within your own lived experience? How many of you notice that it's already there? It's already there. You know when you're a least effective leader, and you also know when you're a most effective leader. So I invite you to jot those down, particularly around the most effective leader, and take a look at those on a regular basis. I actually have a little artifact I'll share with you. We do this fun exercise on Zoom. It's where we invite people to do the same process, but to go find an artifact that represents when they're a most and a least effective leader. And this is my most effective leader artifact. It's a little MailChimp monkey. I don't know if you guys can see it, but he has a little heart on his butt. And my kids always remind me of it because they love it. But what he reminds me of is that when I'm a most effective leader, I'm playful and I'm light, kind of like this monkey. I'm light and I'm playful. We do tough work inside of nonprofits, right? And I know that one of the things that's most helpful for me when I'm a most effective leader is when I'm light and I'm playful. So that's just an example. And I encourage you, not the heart on the butt. Thanks. Oh, y'all are great. See, y'all are a great bunch, by the way. I appreciate all this chat. This is so helpful. All right, let me hop on in. I wanted to get us grounded in our own lived experience, but also wanted to share a few other things that might be going on. We're going to go back in our workbook here for just a minute. And I'm going to zoom out for a little bit around sort of a meta approach to leadership, and kind of partly speaking to the time, the day and age that we're in right now. This particular graphic comes from a guy named Astro Teller. He was the former head of Google X, which is their research and development department. And this particular frame was also brought forward in Thomas Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late. The workbook link is pinned up in the chat, I believe. Thank you for whoever did that. That was great. Hopefully you can see it's a link there. And what he was saying is that the rate of change, and this is the speed and the complexity of change. The speed and the complexity of change has been happening at an exponential rate. Now, before I even move on, how many of you know exactly what I'm talking about because you've experienced this, that the complexity of change has been happening at an exponential rate around you over the last couple of years? Me, yes. You know, and it's interesting too. I was just watching a video about ChatGPT and AI, and they literally use the words double exponential in reference to the speed of change right now. I don't know how you can double exponential. That sounds crazy though. But in case you were wondering whether or not the speed of change is going to get slower, I have break it to you. I have bad news that it's not. It's only going to keep speeding up. But the other thing that he also shared is that our ability to adapt to this as human beings has tended to be more linear. And I'm curious how many of you have noticed yourself in a time that you're on this side of that curve and you're looking back at the change and you're like wondering, gosh, how am I going to adapt to that? I'm not sure how to adapt to that. I've been in this space that the ways that I've been doing things are not actually working anymore. I'm not able to adapt. And how do I do that? And I'm in one of those spaces, by the way. I'm raising my hand right now, and I can see most of you probably raising your hands as well. Well, in this new world, I see some resonance with this up in the chat. In this new world, it really raises a question, which is, what are the leadership beliefs and paradigms of yesterday that got us here that we can honor, but that actually don't work? And in fact, they may not only not work, but they may actually be doing harm. And what needs to arise within us? And the simple expression of this one particular methodology, excuse me, that I'll introduce you to in a moment, comes from a dear mentor of mine named John Berghoff. I'm going to scroll down here to workbook page 6, which is around this external form of conscious leadership. This mentor of mine, John Berghoff, he was actually sharing with me about a story about his mentor, Jody Berg, who actually was the CEO of Vitamix. I don't know if you have a Vitamix blender, but as John likes to say, thank you for your purchases. I didn't work at Vitamix, but he did. But he was talking to one of his mentors, Jody Berg, using this particular frame. And Jody was saying that if us as leaders, if you and I think that our job is to be the few who have the answers, if we think that our job is to have the answers, we may not get very far. And that this outdated paradigm of leadership, about leadership being about the few who have the answers, is really an old model of leadership. This space of telling, controlling, dictating, this top-down approach. I'm curious, by putting a yes up in the chat, how many of you are able to admit right now that we have perhaps no idea how to fully accomplish what it is that we need to accomplish? Who can admit that right now? I'm going to put a yes up into the chat right now too. That perhaps we don't have the answers, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay. And to make this even more poignant, one of the great strengths-based organizational management teachers of our day, his name is Peter Senge. He comes out of MIT. He was a leader ahead of his time, but he coined the term learning organizations. He shared the prevailing system of management is destroying our people because it's about control and not about learning. And what John raised for me is the simple distinction is that we need to figure out, how do we get out of this old model of leadership? Now, that once worked upon a time, but perhaps is not working anymore. And in fact, because of the speed of change, it's actually growing more and more irrelevant. So one of the centerpieces of how to do this is, how do we engage the many in the power of great questions? And how do we co-create our futures together? How do we unlock, invite, co-create our future together. And that instead of it being more about telling, controlling, and dictating, that it's much more engaging the many in the power of great questions. A simple way of saying this is that people have energy towards what they get to create. People have energy towards what they get to create. So I wanted to hop into a little bit more about this methodology that I mentioned earlier. It's a very simple methodology that comes from, this is around the world of this external form of conscious leadership. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to get I don't know why that's doing that. Hold on. Copy. There we go. Like with any tool, appreciative inquiry, this is the methodology that we use. And let me take my face out of this for a minute. This is a tool that we use. It has a rich 40-year history. And it comes out of Case Western University by a guy named Dr. David Cooperrider. And when he was a PhD student at the Weatherhead School of Management, and he was working with the Cleveland Clinic, he noticed very quickly that when we're trying to create change, our questions are a big deal. Our questions are a big deal. As he says here, we live in a world that our questions create. We like to say our questions are fateful and that human systems move in the direction of the questions that we ask. We actually give questions so much reverence that we say that the power of our questions even change the future before the future even arrives. And I'll give you an example about that here in just a minute. But they're kind of like this lens. Some of you have probably glasses, right? If I put these glasses on, I got these red glasses. When I put these glasses on, they're like a lens. And now I see the world as red, right? These are like red tinted glasses. When you put your glasses on, if you have glasses, you start to see the world in a different way. The power of our questions are kind of like a lens that we use. And this is not a new concept. Tom Watson, who was one of the second, I think he was the second IBM, he said, in the future, intelligence will not be measured by what we know in our answers, but by our ability to ask the right questions. One of the most influential people in the world, and controversial too, is Jesus. And Jesus, in the Bible, he asked 307 questions. He was asked 183, and he was only answered 3 of them. He literally had a 100-to-1 ratio of questions to answers. Buddha, yeah, Emily, thank you. Buddha knew it 2,500 years ago. Socrates said, understanding a question is an answer. And they're like these questions I put on. If questions are that important, then one of the next questions is, well, what type of questions are most important in which for us to ask? What type of questions are most important for us to ask? And this is actually where appreciative inquiry strays from some of our own biology. And frankly, this is where appreciative inquiry strays from most theories of change. For most of us, we unconsciously get fixated on what's broken, what's missing, or what's wrong. And our biology says that in our brain stems. I'll speak to this in a little bit, but the neuroscience speaks to our brain stems, which is our fast reactive part of our brain, is looking for the threat. And so many of us tend to look toward that. And what we tend to have is a little bit of an outdated paradigm of problem solving, where we're looking for a need. Then we look for causes of those problems. We have a problem, we look for the causes, we analyze solutions, and then we action plan. And if I want to solve a problem, that may only get us so far. Let me just make this really real for you for just a second. I have a daughter. She's 16. Her name's Addison. And she came home one day with a report card. And on her report card had 3 A's, a B, and a C in social studies, actually. Now, I know what to do. I'm sitting there. I'm like having one of those parent moments, right? Some of you may understand what I'm talking about. I'm like, I know what to do. I train on this stuff. I've facilitated millions of conversations. Don't say it. Don't say it. Don't say it. Addie, how'd you get a C in social studies? I went immediately to the problem, right? How many of you, by show of hands, or really show of hands in chat or something, how many of you done some version of that, maybe even this week in a meeting this week at work, right? You've looked for the problem. You've looked for the issue. You've looked for the challenge, right? How many of you have done that already this week? And I totally have done it too. Let me give you another example about this. And this comes in workbook page 7. This is a famous case study around an airline, and they had a baggage problem. How many of you have ever gone to the airport where you were wanting to go, and your bags weren't there? Well, this particular airline, it was British Airways, had this problem at scale, right? So they could have asked this question. They could have asked the question, right? They had a problem, and they could have asked the question, how do we fix our lost baggage problem, right? Perfectly logical, fair, rational question about problem solving. But then they talked to the appreciative inquiry folks, and they said, you know what? If we ask that question, it's really a deficit-based question. And it may only get us back to neutral, which is really potentially, and it may or may not, but potentially is problem solved. Problem solved. But what if there's a better question? There's a better question. Again, I said earlier, the power of our questions shape our future before the future even arrives. So they decided to ask a different question. And that question was, how might we create an exceptional arrival experience? How might we create an exceptional arrival experience? And this question was not one that was based on the deficit. It was based on the possibility. Or another way you can say it, this is based on the abundance. It's based upon excellence and what we want in the first place. Not how do we solve this problem, but what is it that we even want? We want an exceptional arrival experience. And at that time, when they went through this, and Maria, I saw your chat here about British Airways being the worst now, but at that time, they had actually won many industry innovations and won award after award at that time around making this shift in their work. Let me bring it back to my daughter's report card. When I'm sitting there with Addie, time is scarce, right? We don't have a lot of time many times, which means we don't have much time or attention span to really get into too many questions. And so the quality of our questions really do matter. And what my experience has shown in our work at Thrive Impact, and the research as well, specifically around appreciative inquiry, is that if I go back to my daughter and I ask her about her A's, and I inquire and I go deep into those A's, like, how did you show up? What rhythms were you in that allowed those A's to come about? How did your teacher show up? That is a much better approach to helping her get her C up than if I go and directly ask her about her C. But let me just ask you in a real human way, pop up in the chat. When I ask my daughter about her C's, what does she feel? You all know this. What would you feel if I come and say, hey, how did you get that C? Yeah, there you go. Shame, ashamed, judged, put down, failure, shame, pressured, not good enough, in trouble, unworthy, woo, right? Like, oh, condemned, woo, defensive, mad. And that's exactly what she did, by the way, right? She did not, that was not a great conversation that I had with her. But then when I shifted my approach, if I ask her about her A's, and if I asked you about your A's, your strength, how would you feel? Put a word up in the chat. How would you feel? You'd feel proud, powerful, successful, noticed, worthy, like a winner, wanting to do more of the same. I love that, Lois. That's great. Accomplished, capable. And so you all get this, right? If we come at things from a deficit-based frame, what's wrong, what's broken, how did we get here, how bad is it, how do we fix this? That can lead into a direction that maybe we don't want to go. But what if we ask different questions? What do we really want? What's been the best of us? What's really working? What does excellence look like? There's a great quote by Peter Drucker, the old guru of management. And he said, the task of leadership, and again, when I say leadership, this is all of you. This is not those people who are leaders. They are all of you who have influence over your organization, is to create an alignment of strengths, making a system's weaknesses irrelevant. The task of leadership is to create an alignment of strength, making the system's weaknesses irrelevant. And so instead of having this approach around problem solving, what if we did explore it in a new paradigm? What's the best of us? We call this identity. This is the 4I process of appreciative inquiry. Imagine, what is our bright future? What do we even want? Some powerful research by Dr. Benjamin Hardy shares that when we are able to go into the future and grab the textures, what does it look like, sound like, feel like, and understand that, it becomes pavers for our pathway moving forward in our present. Innovate. How might we really take action then based upon these particular things? And then implement what are our next steps. And if you want, I'm going to go deeper into these, into the lounge. So if you want to hop over into the lounge with me a little bit later, you can. And a lot of these have been used in lots of different experiences. And for sake of time, I'm only going to share one. We've done this through a lot of people co-creating their future, but I wanted to bring up one in particular, one particular situation. This was actually a board that we worked with. And I want you to look at this. This was an anonymous survey. And in this anonymous survey, 1 on the survey means strongly disagree. 2 means disagree. 3 means neutral. 4 and 5 are agree and strongly agree. And the statement was a high level of trust exists between the board members. Some of you may even have a board like this, or maybe you even have a staff like this where you're like, we disagree that there is basically not a good level of trust between board members or between our staff. Maybe you've seen this. Well, what do you do when it comes to appreciative inquiry in this particular situation? Well, we did the exact same thing that we just talked about. We asked them first, what do you notice are the strengths in your survey? We asked them about their strengths first, and then we invited them into what is it that they want. A year from today, what do you want to be celebrating about your board? And invited them to co-create their own future. And these were some of the things that we put down: joyful culture, truth and transparency, passion for our mission, clarity and alignment, inclusion, everyone having a role, systematic and orderly. And by being able to help co-create these particular words with them, now we were able to go into the space of, okay, then how might we get there? Versus just approaching the problem of the lack of trust. Another thing I wanted to mention too, this is something that actually helps to improve things like retention. We did a workshop with an organization called Greater National Mental Health. They're a community mental health organization. And after we did an Innovate workshop, an employee approached their manager after the workshop with a new idea to improve the services, and the idea was implemented the next day. Another employee who was on their way out of the agency, decided to stay after seeing and feeling how and being a part of a co-creative process where they asked people the questions before they came up with the strategy. So if we're thinking about co-creating, most of the time in our leadership structures, we come up with answers first and then try to get buy-in afterwards. That's a space of belonging. We try to get buy-in of our strategies. And instead, we need to flip the script. Co-create first, buy-in first, inviting people into the power of questions, and then creating strategy from there actually increases our retention. It makes us better leaders, and we actually generate a healthy culture. And part of the reason why this works, and we all have seen this potentially, is the last thing is the heliotropic effect. Anybody know what it is? Really, that's where does the sunflower go? It points to the sun when the sun's out. And if you think about the heliotropic effect, is that we go to that which gives us life. And so I want to invite you to reflect on yourself for a moment. In every conversation, does someone walk away with more energy or less energy? What gives you life that you might understand and explore? For sake of time, I'm going to keep on going, and I want to hop into the internal conscious leadership side. Again, we're going to go into a mindfulness practice in the lounge, and so I'd like to invite you into that here in just a little bit. But I just spoke to the external side of conscious leadership, but what about this internal side? And I want to share the work of Dr. Daniel Friedland. He was a dear mentor of mine, and he did write this book, Leading Well from Within. And at the bottom, you see here, it says a neuroscience and mindfulness-based framework for conscious leadership. And one of the things that Dr. Danny used to say is if we want to lead well in the world, the first place we need to lead well is within ourselves. Within ourselves. And he gave us this beautiful vocabulary. Uh-oh, am I still on? I have an unstable connection. I'm good on? Okay, thanks, Jacob. He gave us this beautiful vocabulary to really understand. Have you ever had that moment where you knew what to do. You knew what to do. Similar to what I just shared about my daughter. You knew what to do, and yet you still treated that coworker, friend, child, spouse like a jerk. Anybody? Anybody? Am I the only one? Am I the only one? Yes. Have you ever had that moment where you're like, I know what to do. I know where to go. I know what I'm supposed to do. And then, nope. And you didn't do it. You didn't do it. And one of the things that Dr. Danny said is that it could be perhaps that you didn't have the resources you needed. Or how many of you have had stress? Have you had moments when you've been stressed about how much stress you've had? Has anybody ever had that? Anybody had that? One of the things that Dr. Danny said is that when we're in spaces where the demands, oops, let me use my red. When the demands on us are exceeding the resources available to us, it sends our brains downward into spirals of reactivity. And it creates stress and self-doubt. And those demands can be all kinds of things, similar to what I shared earlier. Systemic demands, organizational demands, individual demands. We all have lots of demands. And when demands exceed the resources available to us, it sends our brains downward into our brainstem, into spirals of reactivity. The work of conscious leadership is how do we create the ways of recognizing when we're in reactivity? Because not all reactivity is bad. Reactivity has kept us alive many times. But when is reactivity causing us more harm than good? And in particular, how do we create the conditions that allow for us to go from reactivity into spaces of creativity? And by the way, when I'm saying creativity, I'm not saying like, can you draw well? It's not, this isn't for the creatives. This is for everybody. Human beings are creative beings. And healthy leaders have the ability to elevate themselves. And I wanted to speak to this too. How many of you notice that when you're in states of reactivity, that it creates fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? This is the language that a lot of people use. That it then creates a trigger in other people. And now we're creating, not only do I have a spiral of reactivity within myself, but now I'm creating a spiral of reactivity amongst others I'm around. My 12-year-old Benjamin graciously reminded me the other day when I was actually in reaction. And he said, Dad, someone needs to break the cycle when we're spiraling down. Someone needs to break the cycle of trigger, react, trigger, react, trigger, react. And what Dr. said is that this space of getting into creativity is when we're in cycles of giving and receiving. And by the way, Dr. Danny did say giving and receiving of love. Yes, the neuroscientist said love, and it was fantastic. When we're able to be in spaces of giving and receiving of our stories, when we're in spaces of giving and receiving of value to one another, when we're in spaces of giving and receiving our listening ear. How many of you remember what we just shared around when we're most effective leaders? Lots of you shared things around listening, hearing, giving of our time and our attention, not being distracted, right? Those are gifts that we're giving. And what Dr. Danny said, one of the most powerful ways for us to get there is through mindfulness and the ability for us to pause, notice, and choose. The ability for us to pause, to notice, and to choose. How many of you feel like right now at work, at your nonprofit, that you're in reactivity mode more than in creativity mode? How many of you feel, by show of whatever you want to put up in the chat, how many of you feel like perhaps you're in more reactivity mode than you are in creativity mode? And when you're in that mode, what does it feel like? What's one word that you feel when you're in that reactive mode? When you're feeling defensive, when the stress, when the self-doubt of tired, a lot of those least effective leadership traits, if you all remember what we talked about. Rushed, brain fried, yes, small, discouraged. And so I want to invite you here in just a little bit. I know we're just about at time, but I want to invite you here into our lounge, because what I wanted to do is invite you into an experience, and I want to bring out the voice of Dr. Yvette Miller, a dear friend of mine. She was also a mentor of Dr. Danny. She actually is the executive doctors at the Red Cross currently. She is a wonderful leader and a wonderful teacher. And she used to share this story with me. She said, Tucker, or she used to share this with Dr. Danny, but she told this to me. She said, you know, Danny was in this space where he was teaching so much, and Yvette came up to her, or came up to him and said, Dr. Danny, man, we ain't going neuroscience our way out of this. We ain't going to neuroscience our way out of this. And what she was really inviting us into is that mindfulness, it's kind of like lifting weights. It doesn't count unless we actually practice. It doesn't count if we just talk about it. And what this pause, notice, choose approach really helps us to understand and go deeper in is learning the practices of noticing, of pausing ourselves. And we did this at the very beginning, of pausing and noticing what's really going on, that will allow us to choose and go up into the more conscious parts of our brain, which allows us to make more kind, creative decisions. And by the way, if you're wondering if this fits in with the research, I'm not going to go through this because I think we're at time, and I'm going to invite Brian up here. But this is a whole study that's actually in Dr. Danny's book as well, around the power of reactivity versus creativity. And what reactivity versus creativity, it has negative for reactivity and positive for creativity, has correlation to all the things that we're held accountable to, that we want in our lives, around revenue growth, around greater impact, around profitability and ROI, around new program development, overall performance, is that when we're in reactivity, it is a lot less effective as leadership. And when we're in creativity, it's a lot more effective as leadership. That being said, again, I want to invite you into our lounge where we're going to be able to go into a little bit more. We're going to practice a mindfulness practice that allows you to practice some of your noticing skills. And we're also going to go a little bit deeper into the neuroscience and also see where everybody else wants to go around this conscious leadership work.
And what an excellent...
Oh, Brian, I can't hear you. Wait, maybe it's on me.
Uh-oh.
Oh, there we go. That's on me. Sorry.
Yes. What an excellent way to kick off the community stage. Tucker, thank you so much. This was really incredible. So many of the things that you were saying resonated with me, and I'll start with just the way you defined resonance, right? The currency of community. It's the first time I had heard it described that way. I think it's really terrific. And whether it was the quote from your pastor about, if you're disillusioned, what was that illusion that you started with? Energy givers versus energy takers, like just so many frameworks. I saw the level of resonance in the chat. I know you saw it too. You were getting so many thumbs up, so many kudos. And we've got a couple of questions really quickly before you jump into the lounge, where I encourage everyone to jump into the lounge with Tucker for the exercise. But one of our participants asked whether you would be able to share the actual survey, the example that you gave with the board. Could you share that survey with anyone who's interested, and they may be able to replicate it with their board? And I'd love to double click on that, Tucker. How did you fast forward a year later or any period later and see if they moved from strongly disagree in that culture? What kind of change did they wind up embodying?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did not do another anonymous survey later, but I have recently talked to their ED, and they have definitely moved in a much better direction. They were wanting to bring us back to actually continue this process in a deeper way with them, but just by kicking that off for them, it reframed their entire approach to their board in the first place. And so, yeah, they have had positive change because of that interaction and that understanding and that reframing, for sure.
That's really awesome. One other question before we let you jump, and then I'll give everyone their instructions on how to join you. So do you have a favorite book around the topic of appreciative inquiry?
Oh, that's actually a really great question. Yeah, there's one that's called SOAR.
SOAR?
Yeah, let me see. Let me get the exact title for you. It's by a woman named, here, let me pull it up, by Jackie Stavros. And she actually did a lot of deep work with Dr. David Cooperrider It's called Learning to Soar: Creative Strategy that Inspires Innovation and Engagement. And it's literally SOAR stands for a metaphor that's around strengths, opportunities, aspiration, and results. And they were actually trying to be very clear about the difference between a SWOT analysis and a SOAR analysis. It's actually a reframing of the SWOT analysis. For many of you who have done SWOT analyses, yeah, there you go. Thanks, Giselle. So SOAR is a great book for that, for sure. And then we do a lot of deeper training on that as well.
Well, the entire session, the last 45 minutes, I feel like what you've done for us, Tucker, is help to reframe in the positive and really address some of the issues that can drive our nonprofit leaders to burnout and really not achieving the results that we want to in these important missions that everyone supports. So thank you so much on behalf of Community Boost, on behalf of everyone here at the Nonprofit Marketing Summit. This was terrific. We're going to move you into your lounge. And as I say, I encourage everyone to join Tucker for the next 10 to 15 minutes on an interactive session and continue the dialogue.
You bet. Hey, last reflection just for all of you. I'll put this up in the chat. I said this earlier. Learning doesn't happen unless we try, and we do. Learning, if it stays up here, it doesn't really do a whole lot for us, and that's why you're in a conference which is going to have a lot of learning. I put this up there, which is I invite you to jot down what are one or two small steps that you can take this week to take what you've learned in your head and apply it into your world, and to try to lean into this. So I just want to leave that with one final reflection before I hop into the lounge: is make sure turn this into a doing as soon as you can, because those iterations are going to be really powerful for you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tucker.
Cool.